Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Roshi. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, everyone at Upaya. Coming back here had such a sense of coming home, and the young practitioners and all the practitioners, all the residents here, gave me such a warm welcome. It was really heartwarming and really lovely and made me just really feel a sense of friendship and profound affection, even for the residents I haven't gotten to talk to yet, but I hope to rectify all of that sooner or later. So, you know me, I'm going to talk about politics. And it was interesting when I was up here extemporizing at a Gallup while we were doing this weekend teaching, I was like, maybe I shouldn't be talking about politics here. And then I thought, no, politics is how we act on our beliefs, our principles, our commitments, our values together in public life. And it's never really separate from spiritual life and spiritual practice, or it shouldn't be, though we could argue that it too often is. So I'm also going to talk about some gnarly stuff. I'm not sure I have ever done a trigger warning, but but you also know me. Of course I am. So, but don't worry, that comes later. And Roshi spoke this weekend about imagination, I think, as perceiving what does not yet exist. But I write nonfiction. I think of fiction and painting as making things that, making images, making stories about people, about things that do not yet exist in the world. But as a nonfiction writer, I always felt very close to photographers. We're finding the traces, the patterns, the nuances, the complexities of what's already out there. And that's also a creative process. And for me, always trying to trace the underlying patterns and meanings, the connections and lineages, the causalities and possibilities, to find the threads that tie everything together, that run through everything. But this isn't really specific to us officially creative people. Everybody does it. We're always interpreting things. I think when I first walked into San Francisco Zen Center in 2001, and Paul Haller, who's a remarkable teacher there, just said that, we can't not do it. You hear a noise outside and you hear truck. And, all of us are constantly engaging in these acts of imagination, of interpreting what we see, what we hear, sometimes telling ourselves stories that aren't true, aren't correct, are projective, but often there's a real art to paying attention to what the data is, connecting it to what you know, listening deeply, studying carefully, finding these things out. We're constantly doing this with each other if we're present with each other. And so this is very much a talk about empathy and compassion and their opposites. We often praise empathy as an emotion, but I also think of it as an act of imagination. We're putting something together and you bang your thumb with the hammer. It takes a little imagination on my part to know what's going on with your thumb. And, and we say, I feel for you, even though we don't literally feel it. Then that's the essence of empathy, is feeling what you do not literally feel, extending yourself, your care beyond the boundaries of the body, which are the kind of physical limits of the self, what you feel. And it happens in so many different ways that stitch us together, weave us together, connect us when we have that empathy, that alignment, that understanding, that care. Somebody tells us that their house burned down or their grandmother died, and we immediately imagine what that experience must be and try and respond from that basis. So, and that you don't exactly know, but you have a sense of it, a sense that there's suffering, that there's loss, that there might be a lot of things that need to happen next. So, and your job is not really to be exact, but to care, to listen, to show up, to know that it's not literally you. which people also get involved in when it becomes your house burned down. I am so upset. You may have met that person. But this active imaginative empathy often translates into active care, which I think is when Roshi says it becomes compassion, the small and large ways we care for and take care of those we love, or I could just say, care about, the way we care for the larger world. And the word care, which interestingly has been appearing in kind of radical political discourse a lot as literal caregiving, the work of people like Ajahn Poo, whose name I just mispronounced because I learn everything through reading, who are actually working with professional people who do caregiving for a living. But the fact that the word care actually means both to take a wholehearted interest in something and to actually tend to the needs, that all that is in the four letters, the one syllable, is a nice reminder that the care is a feeling can and often should lead to the care that is an act. So Roshi wrote in Standing at the Edge, her wonderful book that I got to write the introduction to. Our ability to include another's experience into our empathy, our ability to include another's experience into our own, is a fundamental human capacity, one that is important to the healthy functioning of friendships, family structures, and societies. Empathy can bring the best of the human heart forward if we can stay with our feelings of empathy while keeping ourselves. We can stand solid on the healthy earth of empathy. Yet balance is delicate on the edge, and empathy can easily tip toward distress if we fuse too strongly with another's physical, emotional, or mental state. We are sure to fall over the edge and into the murky swamp of empathic distress. Empathy, literally taken, is feeling into another, while compassion is feeling for another, accompanied by the aspiration to take action that benefits the other. Empathy is often a precursor to compassion and part of compassion, but it is not compassion. And those two paragraphs for Roshi. Sorry, back to me. I think of this imaginative act of feeling what you do not feel in your own body, what is not happening to you, of caring about what is not you yourself, as one of the ways the world is made whole, is sewn together, is perceived and experienced as relational, as how connections are made and tended. And many Native American peoples use the phrase, all my relations, to recognize what we could call interspecies interbeing, to use that phrase of Thich Nhat Hanh's. And so I think all the stuff I'm shuffling towards is about how we connect, the ways we're connected, this work of empathy and compassion that recognizes and makes connection. Contemporary science tells us the ways in which we are interconnected, interdependent, interrelated, in which interbeing is a fact of nature, not just an aspiration of our practice. I'm often struck by how the climate leaders and scientists I'm so lucky to get to hang out with here and there have the imaginative power to turn all this abstract data about the state of our Earth, about fossil fuel emissions, ocean acidification, sea level rise, ice melt, and all the rest of it, but to turn the complex data into a real understanding of what it means for every living thing, for every place, for every species, for every system. And something that's been so moving about being a climate activist for the last 20 years is what I think of as the sadness of the scientists, the people for whom this information, somehow they're able to enter into and make it vivid and understand it. And I know that for me, as somebody who's not so good at that, I have to really kind of work at translating the data into impacts and feeling the way those impacts motivate me to do the climate work. So it's, we all do it in different ways. Some of us do it professionally as different kinds of caregivers, educators, as parents, as beloveds, as friends, as people who feed the hungry or visit prisoners or develop these other compassionate relationships. And we're in the middle of a furious discourse about who we should care about, who we should protect, who we should take care of. And now comes the ugly part. I'm going to talk about J.D. Vance. But early this year, and I truly think J.D. Vance, in 100 years or so, when somebody's writing history, the most memorable thing about him might be that he's almost the only public figure ever to be told off by 2 popes in one season. So early this year, Vance, who is very public about being a Catholic convert, interpreted what's called Ordo Amoris, the order of love, the way that love should work in the world, by saying you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world, clearly trying to set up a hierarchy to justify the fact that he's participating in absolutely monstrous attacks on refugees, immigrants, and anybody brown enough to resemble them, including a Native woman, an indigenous woman in Arizona who was nabbed by ICE this week. But Pope Francis smacked him down as one of the last things he did, writing, Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. In other words, the human person is not a mere individual, relatively expansive, with some philanthropic feelings. The human person is a subject with dignity who, through the constitutive relationship with all, especially with the poorest, can gradually mature into his identity and vocation. The true ordo amoris that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. Pope Leo, his successor, who comes from Chicago and seems like a remarkable person, has been even more outspoken in defense of immigrants and refugees and those under attack. In early February, he shared an article from a Catholic publication with the headline, J.D. Vance is wrong. Jesus doesn't ask us to rank our love for others. I'm not a Catholic theologian, although my mother emerged from a very intensely Irish Catholic background, and there's kind of a hangover. And a very devout aunt of mine is still going to Mass every day in Albuquerque. But you know, all that raises the question of who and what do we care about and what don't we? What are the limits of our care? And here I want to go into a completely fascinating narrative that I think gives us some really profound metaphors and insights. I want to talk about leprosy, which I found out about one day years ago when I offered to drive an elderly Latina historian home, and the guy in the car with us, and she had met Che Guevara in Cuba as part of her work as a radical historian. We started talking about Che. The movie The Motorcycle Diaries had just come out. And The Motorcycle Diaries does not accurately represent what Alberto Guanado and Ernesto Guevara, known as Che, were doing on that journey. They were young doctors who had decided, as a radical act of compassion and solidarity, to focus on leprosy. And so they're actually visiting the leprosy centers across South America on their motorcycle. And Che had actually written some academic papers on the disease while he was still a doctor. And they started talking about leprosy, and the man said something absolutely fascinating. And I started investigating leprosy. I did a story for Harper's about it. I'd already visited the leper colony at Molokai. I went and visited the other major US colony for people with the disease, which is an entirely curable disease, but they had people who had been essentially institutionalized all their life, had been disfigured by the disease, who had no place else to go. It was it was remarkable. Leprosy is a bacterial infection to which almost all of us are immune, and the small percentage of us who aren't have a hard time catching it. It's almost the least communicable communicable disease there is. And when you catch it, it may be many years before it does anything at all to you, making the method of contagion a little mysterious even now. At the place, the Carville leprosy colony in central Louisiana, in its 100+ year history, no staff member had ever contracted the disease. But leprosy is really two diseases, a bacterial infection and a social stigma. And the latter was often the most painful, the most destructive, the most miserable part of it, which is why Native Hawaiians called it the separating sickness, because when somebody contracted it, they were very susceptible, and it came with white people to Hawaii. When they contracted it, they were sent off to Molokai, separated from their loved ones, and the isolation was so much part of the suffering. And a missionary doctor who went to India, a surgeon with a strong sense of purpose, Paul Brand, did some remarkable work on the disease, and he wrote about it in a book called The Gift of Pain. What he realized as somebody who is a specialist in hand surgery in particular was that the disease did not actually cause the injuries that the disease is famous for. He realized that it's the numbness. Leprosy thrives in the cooler parts of the body, the eyes, the hands, the feet, the extremities. It infects the nerves and kills the nerves, so you lose your feeling. He wondered why the people who had been cured of the disease, which is very easily curable by modern medicines, were continuing to injure them, to have severe impact on their extremities, etc. And so he realized that what was actually happening was that it was the not feeling that was causing all these injuries, not the disease itself. If your eyes have lost their feeling and are no longer sending signals to your brain, you don't feel if they're dry, you don't feel if something has gotten into them. If you've lost the feeling in your hands, you hold the cigarette till it burns your fingers, you pick up something red hot, you don't take care of the blisters on your feet and the fact that your shoes don't fit. And I found that such an extraordinary metaphor. It's hard to care for what you can't feel. And he also found that for these patients, their hands and feet didn't feel like themselves. And so they really had to learn to take care of their bodies the way you take care of somebody else, to carefully tend them. They made a lot of devices to help people avoid the burns, the cuts, the blisters, and other injuries. And so his job was to teach them to have a kind of empathy with these parts of their bodies that didn't feel like themselves anymore. He wrote, "Sometimes I felt like a schoolmaster with the odd sense that I was introducing the boys to their own limbs, begging their minds to welcome the insensitive parts of their bodies. It was easy to think of the boys as being careless or irresponsible until I understood their point of view. Pain, along with its cousin touch, is distributed universally on the body, providing a sort of boundary of self. Even after surgery, they tended to view their repaired hands and feet as tools or artificial appendages. They lack the basic instinct of self-protection that pain normally provides." And I thought that was so extraordinary. How do you take care of that you don't feel, literally? And it brings us back to that question of empathy, empathy connected to the skillfulness, the intention, the action that is compassion. And we're in a moment in this country's history where the question of who do you feel for? Who do you care about? What are the limits of care and compassion? Do we expand it to include everyone? We're seeing in some sense the opposite of it, the cruelty, the will to do harm, often a kind of glee in causing suffering, unnecessary suffering. And, some people go numb to kill off their own compassion, their own care, sometimes even to themselves. J. Robert Lipton studied Hiroshima survivors and found what he called psychic numbing, that to survive the horrors of what they'd experienced, they'd gone numb. So much death, so many hideous ways to die, such utter destruction all around them. But the problem when you go numb is, how do you come back to life? And I think in a broader way, we live in a society, many sectors of which are trying to teach us not to feel, if you're a Christian, not to care about non-Christians, if you're white, not to care about non-white people, if you're straight, not to care about non-straight people, if you're cisgender, not to care about trans people, if you're US born, to demonize and disown any moral responsibility for immigrants and refugees and people who weren't born here. And so we're really, I think the great conflicts of our time in this country, which are often described as right and left, which are really outdated terminologies, could better be thought of as connectors and disconnectors, as people who morally, ecologically, emotionally recognize that everything is connected, and the disconnectors who often deny even the scientific and factual connections when they deny the reality of climate change, ecological impacts, the need for regulations of clean drinking water, clean air, etc. And of course, the title of this talk about Sutra and Suture is because the word, they have the same origin. And I think of great teachings as sewing things together, as mapping the connections, tracing the tributaries and distributaries of the great rivers of life and meaning and possibility for us. So, the eye is a needle some find useful, though the thread, of course, is shadow, wrote Brenda Hillman in her poem, String Theory Sutra. The English and Latin word suture has the same root as Sanskrit sutra or Pali sutta. They both have to do with sewing. The sutras, the most sacred texts of Buddhism, were named for the fact that they were originally sewn together. The flat blades of palm leaves were strung together by two lines of thread that tied together the stiff, narrow pages like accordion blinds. The books were copied by hand over and over in those tropical climates, subtropical climates of decay. Thus, leaf became book, and knowledge was held together and transmitted in a thread, a line, a lineage. So I wanted that I think the disease gives us a metaphor of how do you feel what you don't feel. Suture and sutra give us a metaphor of how do you trace the connections, or how do you sew back together what has been broken or torn apart? How do you find again the connections that are not supposed to be there? I wrote an essay years ago when I was a columnist at Harper's called The Ideology of Isolation, which is what I think right-wing philosophy has become. The idea that if nothing is connected to anything else, then we have no responsibility towards anything or anyone else. The idea that since it's an anti-systemic thinking, in which poverty arises through laziness and other forms of moral turpitude, in which all the systemic causes of disease, of poverty, of suffering, the things that drive people to come here as refugees are denied, and there's nothing but personal virtue, which millionaires are supposed to have, and personal vice, which poor people are supposed to have. And the fantasy behind this is really that we are all self-made men or women, that we are independent, that we are individualistic, that or at least ideally we're individuals standing on our own 2 feet, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, don't owe anything to anyone, given that every single one of us was born and raised, that nobody will survive those first years of life without extraordinary amounts of care. It's a delusion. I often think, when my friends started to have babies when I was much younger, and I saw just how intense the care of raising a kid is, if there's 8 billion of us on Earth, an Earth that's only about 5 billion years old, those first 2 years of care means there's 16 billion years of devoted human care on Earth right now, that human care is more time than the entire history of the planet. It's such a massive force. None of us would live without it. None of us are autonomous. All of us need the air that was first put in the atmosphere by blue-green algae and plants. We need water. We can live only a few minutes without air, a few days without water, a few weeks without food. We're now seeing people suffering from lack of each other, the profundity of loneliness, and this kind of maladaptation to isolation that comes after loneliness. So then, but in the ideology of isolation, personal responsibility really means lack of responsibility for anything else, a kind of carelessness. Freedom means a lack of responsibility and connection. So in the ideology of isolation, I was always insisting that categorical differences outweigh a common humanity. It's always dividing us up, the deserving and undeserving, the elect and the damned, the native, the U.S. born and the immigrant. And it's constantly arguing for a reduction of solidarity. There's a remarkable line by Bell Hooks in her book about men, where she says the first violence patriarchy commits is not against women, it's against men, where they have to kill something off in themselves to become capable of the harm that patriarchy, which is not all men, but patriarchy does to women in its hatred and fear of the feminine, and really fear of vulnerability, of interbeing, that, was interpenetration, of dependence, and a sense of dependent co-arising. And so I think it's both a kind of delusion and a kind of disease, an inability to feel things that are part of our full humanity, which imposes empathy or compassion, responsibility, the duty to care for others, which is often felt as overwhelming as a burden. So the ideology of isolation is an attempt to escape it. So this week, the big story in this country is the Epstein files. I don't know how many of you saw yesterday that so many of the survivors of that child rape and trafficking ring were actually in the balcony of the House watching the legislation pass that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, had tried to hold off for so long. And, in the Epstein case, I often think of that kind of sexual abuse as a ritual enactment of separateness, of the separating sickness, the ability to cause harm in somebody so intimately is a way, I think, of demonstrating to yourself and whoever else that you don't feel for these people. They don't matter. They're outside your circle of care. And we've seen these very powerful elite men outed in this way and in many others as that kind of deformed, distorted, numbed, and disordered by this inability to feel. And we're seeing it also with ICE attacks on immigrants. We're seeing it with the extraordinary attacks on the most basic human needs. And the attack on USAID and dismantling it is said will ultimately cause the death of about, I believe the estimate is 14 million human beings. Atul Gawande, who was a surgeon who also writes for The New Yorker, was in charge of global health for USAID. And for that magazine, he recently wrote, on a budget of just $24 per American, out of the $15,000 in taxes paid per person last year, they had saved lives at an almost unimaginable scale. An independent peer-reviewed analysis in The Lancet estimated that USAID assistance had saved 92 million lives over 2 decades. As of November 5th, it is estimated that USAID's dismantling has already caused the deaths of 600,000 people, 2/3 of them children. This kind of deformity of care was manifested in a really extraordinary way last week when the novelist Joyce Carol Oates, who is still on Twitter, which I think everyone should leave, but that's another story. I know it is a charnel ground and some people are practicing there. But she just tweeted, the richest man in the world never posts about family and friends and children, animals and pets, books and movies he likes. She basically said, what a bereft life he has, how impoverished he is. And this man who personally destroyed USAID, even though he probably could afford to personally fund it indefinitely with his hundreds of billions of dollars, had a meltdown and, on this platform he bought to distort the public discourse towards a kind of right-wing white supremacist misogyny. And it was grotesque to see somebody who cares so much about his own reputation and cared so little about the deaths of millions. And so I think one of the questions is, what is it that leads us away from what Pope Francis talked about, a kind of universal compassion? What leads us towards it? About, the crimes of the administration, the involvement of these ultra elites doesn't end there. When we had the shutdown, there was actually funding provided for SNAP, the successor to food stamps, which keeps 1/8 of the population, millions of us, 1 in 8, a high percentage of them children, from severe hunger. The money was there, but Trump refused to release it. Now that the shutdown is over, they're trying to cut people off, force them to reapply, etc. And so Politico recently reported the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program provides an average of $6 per day for nearly 42 million people, 40% of whom are children. Under the new law, parents and older Americans will be required to meet stricter work requirements, and states eventually will have to share in the cost of SNAP benefits, which could force further program cuts, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Tens of thousands of legal immigrants will also lose access to the program under the law. This intentional forcing the most impoverished among us to starve, and which is also part of what's killing people abroad with the end of USAID, where they actually destroyed millions upon millions of dollars of food that could have just been delivered. And so we're living in a country whose most powerful men are manifesting extraordinary murderous cruelty nationally and internationally, many of whom have also inflicted it up close. There was a heartrending story in the New York Times last week. Matt Gaetz, the disgraced congressman who was forced to step down for a number of hideous abuses. One of them was sex trafficking and having sex with an underage girl who poverty had forced into the work. And it turned out, and this is just so horrific, she was doing sex work to pay for braces. One of her parents was homeless, both of them were indigent, and who the hell wants to have sex with somebody who doesn't want to have sex with you, but really needs medical care? Epstein was manipulating one of the girls or young women by promising to help her get care for her mother with brain cancer. And so you can see that the victims were working, were ethical, were caring, and that their abusers were not, and that we need other criteria for who matters, who is valued. But we are seeing, I think, what's happened with the Trump administration. I know, now I told you we were going to talk about politics. They assumed that we were selfish and that we were cowardly and that they could do what they were going to do and that nothing could stop them. And what we've seen in so many different ways in the courts, in the churches, in the streets, in so many ways, is extraordinary acts of bravery and solidarity. And solidarity I think also relates to these definitions I've been exploring. Solidarity is inherently a cross difference with somebody who isn't exactly like you. You don't, there's a kind of perverse form of solidarity that's like, white solidarity or, kind of clubbishness. But usually solidarity is reaching out, it's building alliances with people who are different from you in some way. And one of the most extraordinary and beautiful things we've seen, because we've seen moral ugliness, but also moral beauty, is how people who are not themselves under threat stepped up to defend their neighbors, their fellow humans from ICE and the Border Patrol, first in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C., in Portland, Oregon, in extraordinary ways in Chicago, and now they've come to Charlotte, North Carolina. This was not a given. I don't think we've seen people willing to risk being charged with felonies, to be injured, having guns pointed in their faces, being severely injured by the violence of ICE. I don't know if we've seen people show up to defend immigrants quite like this. And we've had other points in our country's history where almost nobody defended Japanese Americans when they were interned, for example, although some beautiful stuff did happen behind the scenes. My friend Shizu Segal documented, for example, the farmers who just took care of their neighbors' farms till they returned or ran their businesses, protected their property, but mostly nothing happened. But Japanese Americans became extraordinary practitioners of compassionate solidarity. I've seen them step up for Muslims after 9/11, for the immigrants currently under attack. And I think that's another question about this exercise of empathy. How does your own suffering or your own oppression make you understand others? How does it make you bigger? Because in a sense, I think I'm talking about there are physical limits. My physical feeling does not extend beyond my fingers, including the one I sliced, which has a limited edition Hiroshige print bandage on it now. And so you have these physical limits. How far do you feel beyond? And I think we talk in Buddhism about boundless compassion. And I think Pope Francis was talking about something similar. And there's a sense, I think, of vastness, of being connected. I think of Walt Whitman's "Nothing human is alien to me," and I think I know a lot of biologists who would say nothing living is alien to me. And so the sense in which you become vast, to again invoke Whitman, you contain multitudes, I think is a form of being both vulnerable and powerful. It's how you suture yourself to the greater, the greater Sangha, the beloved community, the web of life. And the opposite, I think, makes you very small and tight, a knot you're afraid to untie. And now, with 2 minutes to go, and Roshi giving me a gimlet eye, because I've been known to have a sufficiency of words and then some, I want to end by reading what a North Carolina activist posted on social media today about what she and her community are doing. She said, "Another packed night with probably over 600 people coming out in Charlotte, North Carolina, to be trained to join the safety patrols who are fanning out across the city each day to make sure that everyone can get to work and school safely and home again at night. Every night, hundreds more people come out to find how to plug in. And while the Customs and Border Patrol and ICE expanded their operations to other cities, so did we. While I write this, a press conference is happening in Durham at a daycare center, the daycare center called Simbra NC, to get a safety patrol sent out so families could safely come get their children. Dozens of local elected officials, business owners, and faith leaders are there, speaking out. And this morning, as CBP and ICE showed up in Raleigh, nearly 700 people had already signed up overnight to be ready to protect their city. A huge community meeting and training is happening in Raleigh right now to bring more people in. An hour ago, a mass protest marched downtown there. These are frightening times. A friend messaged me to say her daughter's school wasn't letting the teens leave campus for lunch because their city feels too dangerous. A teacher in my hometown told me her students aren't showing up. 21,000 students were absent in Charlotte yesterday. But the danger isn't coming from those they call threats. It's coming from the lawless, chaotic, and cruel federal intrusion into our towns. But here in this room, it feels safe. I'm sitting in a place where we can see and feel the North Carolina I know and love. The people who love their neighbors, who cherish our children, and who won't fall for fear-mongering this administration is using to divide us. I know that we are the most of us. Thank you.